Deep in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, where the morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines like funeral shrouds, there are family names that locals still won't speak after sunset. Names carved into weathered headstones in forgotten graveyards, whispered in warnings passed down through generations, and etched into the very bedrock of these mountains, alongside secrets that were never meant to see daylight. These weren't your typical mountain families scraping by on moonshine and coal dust. These were bloodlines that discovered something else entirely in the shadowed valleys where civilization feared to tread. Something that offered power, prosperity, and protection in exchange for practices so disturbing that even hardened federal marshals would turn away rather than document what they witnessed. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a place apart. Their ancient peaks predate human memory. Their hollows run deeper than any survey has ever mapped, and their silence has swallowed more secrets than any graveyard. But between 1847 and 1923, 5 particular families ventured into territories that existed beyond the reach of both law and scripture, returning with abilities that defied explanation and prosperity that came at a cost their descendants are still paying today. What you're about to hear isn't found in any historical record. These stories were deliberately buried, their witnesses silenced, their evidence destroyed or sealed away in federal vaults that officially don't exist. But in the mountain communities where these families once held sway, the old-timers still remember. They remember the unexplained lights that danced across certain ridgelines on moonless nights. They remember the way livestock would refuse to cross invisible boundaries, how hunting dogs would whimper and retreat from specific valleys, and how the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent presence near certain family compounds. The 5 clans we're about to explore didn't just practice folk magic or mountain superstition. They discovered gateways to something far older and infinitely more dangerous than anything European settlers brought to these shores. They made bargains with entities that existed in the spaces between worlds, agreements sealed not with signatures, but with blood, witnessed not by lawyers, but by shadows that moved independently of any light source. Each family's story begins with desperation, the kind of bone-deep desperation that drives people to seek help from sources that decent folk know better than to approach. Starvation winters that claimed children, diseases that no doctor could cure, debts that threatened to destroy generations of struggle, failed crops that meant watching your family waste away. The kind of desperation that makes a person willing to listen when something inhuman offers a solution. But these weren't simple deals with the devil. These were complex, multi-generational contracts that bound entire bloodlines to obligations that grew more demanding with each passing year. The families received exactly what they bargained for: wealth, health, success, power. But they also received something else, something that changed them on a cellular level, that marked their children and their children's children with signs that couldn't be hidden or explained away. The Ashford family of Pike County discovered this truth in 1863 when Patriarch Samuel Ashford made a bargain to save his dying infant son. The child lived, but every Ashford born afterward came into the world with eyes that reflected light, like an animal's, and an uncanny ability to see in complete darkness. More disturbing was their need to feed on something other than conventional food. Local livestock began dying under mysterious circumstances, found bloodless but unmarked, always within a mile of Ashford property. The Crowley clan in Breathitt County learned that supernatural prosperity requires supernatural maintenance. Their coal mines produced the richest veins in the region, but only as long as the family performed monthly rituals in underground chambers that predated human settlement. When young Marcus Crowley attempted to break from family tradition in 1891, the mines flooded overnight, trapping 17 workers in passages that rescue teams swore had been bone dry just hours before. Marcus's body was found 3 days later in a sealed mine shaft, positioned as if he'd been kneeling in prayer, though the expression on his face suggested he'd seen something that prayer couldn't protect him from. The Whitmore family built their lumber empire on trees that grew in groves, where the Cherokee once warned that the earth itself was hungry. Their success came with a price that manifested in ways that defied medical explanation. Every Whitmore developed a peculiar condition where their skin would periodically shed in complete layers, revealing new flesh beneath that bore intricate scarring in patterns that resembled no known written language. Family members learned to time these molting periods with the lunar calendar, isolating themselves during the transformations that left them screaming in agony but somehow stronger afterward. Then there were the Hulcom healers of Letcher County, whose ability to cure any ailment made them legendary throughout the region. Travelers came from hundreds of miles away seeking their remedies, and none left disappointed. But the Hulcoms paid for their gift by absorbing the essence of every disease they treated. Their bodies became living museums of human suffering, displaying symptoms of illnesses that had been cured decades earlier. The family's medical journals, discovered after their compound burned in 1919, revealed that they weren't just treating diseases, they were housing them, becoming repositories for maladies that would otherwise spread through the population. The fifth family, the Blackwood clan of Harlan County, discovered that some forms of wealth require feeding. Their banking and trading empire grew from a single transaction made in a cave where the walls wept a substance that wasn't quite water and wasn't quite blood. The Blackwoods became the financial powerhouse of the region, but their success demanded regular offerings to entities that existed in the spaces between the physical world and somewhere else entirely. Family ledgers written in multiple hands, but identical script-detailed transactions that involved not just money, but years of human life, memories extracted from living minds, and emotional experiences distilled into forms that could be stored and traded. What united these 5 families wasn't just their supernatural prosperity, but their absolute secrecy about the true source of their success. They developed an elaborate network of mutual protection, ensuring that no single family's practices would be exposed lest all their secrets come to light. They intermarried strategically, creating bloodlines that carried multiple supernatural obligations. They established businesses that served as fronts for activities that had nothing to do with conventional commerce. And they created a shadow government within the mountain communities where their word was law and their enemies simply disappeared. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territories. They had contacts in state government, federal agencies, and even international organizations that dealt with phenomena that officially didn't exist. When investigators got too close to the truth, evidence would vanish, witnesses would recant their statements, and the investigators themselves would often suffer mysterious accidents that left them either dead or permanently changed in ways that destroyed their credibility. But power built on supernatural foundations is inherently unstable. The entities that granted these families their abilities had their own agendas, and as the decades passed, it became clear that the initial bargains were just the beginning of much more complex relationships. The families found themselves caught between their human lives and obligations to forces that viewed humanity as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The children born into these bloodlines often displayed abilities that went far beyond what their parents had bargained for. Some could see through the eyes of animals, others could influence weather patterns, and a few developed the ability to step briefly into parallel versions of reality where different choices had been made. But these gifts came with compulsions that grew stronger with each generation, urges that demanded satisfaction regardless of moral considerations. As the 20th century approached, the families realized that their supernatural benefactors were preparing for something larger than individual family prosperity. The rituals were becoming more elaborate, the demands more frequent, and the consequences of failure more severe. What had begun as desperate bargains for survival had evolved into something that threatened not just the families themselves, but the very fabric of reality in the regions they controlled. The mountain communities began to change in ways that couldn't be explained by natural forces or human activity. Plants grew in impossible configurations. Animals displayed behaviors that defied their species' nature, and the landscape itself seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The shadows grew longer as the century progressed, and what had begun as desperate bargains in remote hollows slowly transformed into something far more organized and terrifying. By the 1850s, the five families had established what could only be described as a shadow network, their influence spreading through the mountains like poison through water. The Ashfords, Crowleys, Whitmores, Hulcoms, and Blackwoods no longer operated as isolated clans, making individual deals with otherworldly forces. They had become something else entirely, a confederation of the damned bound by shared secrets and mutual dependency. The transformation began when young Marcus Ashford discovered something troubling in his family's mining records. While cataloging generations of supernatural transactions, he noticed patterns that extended far beyond his bloodline. The entities his ancestors had bargained with weren't unique to the Ashford mines. The same signatures, the same symbols, the same unmistakable marks appeared in documents he'd glimpsed during rare visits to other family compounds. The realization struck him like a physical blow. They weren't dealing with different supernatural forces. They were all feeding the same ancient hunger. This discovery led to the first gathering of the five families in 1854, held in a natural amphitheater deep within the Daniel Boone National Forest. The location itself seemed to choose them, a circular clearing where no grass grew and compasses spun wildly. Representatives from each bloodline arrived under cover of darkness, their faces bearing the distinctive marks their family bargains had left behind. The Ashfords with their silver-flecked eyes, the Crowleys with their unnaturally pale skin, the Whitmores with their elongated fingers, the Hulcoms with their ability to see in perfect darkness, and the Blackwoods with their shadows that moved independently of their bodies. What they shared that night changed everything. Each family had been told by their supernatural benefactors that their bargains were unique, that they alone had been chosen for these arrangements. The truth was far more sinister. They were all components in a larger design, each family's supernatural gifts complementing the others in ways that would have been impossible to achieve individually. The Ashfords could locate precious metals with supernatural precision. The Crowleys could heal any wound or illness, ensuring the network's survival. The Whitmores could influence the weather, providing cover for their operations. The Hulcoms could see through any darkness, making them perfect scouts and guards. The Blackwoods could manipulate shadows and perception, rendering their activities invisible to outside observation. The entities they served weren't competing forces, but aspects of something much older and more patient. Local Cherokee legends spoke of the Nunahai, beings that existed between the physical and spirit worlds, but these weren't the benevolent spirits of tribal memory. These were something else, something that had been waiting in the deep places of the earth since before human memory began. The families had been carefully selected and shaped over generations to serve as anchors, keeping these entities tethered to the physical world while slowly expanding their influence. By 18th, the five families had established what they called the Compact, a formal agreement that bound them together in ways that transcended mere human alliance. The ritual that sealed their pact took place during a total lunar eclipse, when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for their supernatural patrons to manifest more directly. Each family contributed blood, but not just their own. They had spent months collecting samples from every person living within a 50-mile radius, mixing it into a substance that pulsed with its own malevolent life. The ceremony required each family to sacrifice something precious beyond measure. The Ashfords offered their youngest child, a girl of 7, whose silver eyes had marked her as the most gifted of her generation. The Crowleys surrendered their ability to die naturally, condemning themselves to experience every moment of pain they healed in others. The Whitmores gave up their capacity for human speech, communicating thereafter only through the whispers of wind and storm. The Hulcoms traded their ability to see daylight, their enhanced night vision coming at the cost of being blinded by even the faintest natural light. The Blackwoods offered their reflections, becoming beings who cast no shadow and appeared in no mirror, gradually losing their connection to their own humanity. The rewards were immediate and terrifying. Their individual supernatural abilities amplified exponentially when working together. The Ashfords could now locate not just precious metals, but anything of value, including the deepest secrets of their enemies. The Crowleys' healing powers extended beyond on the physical, allowing them to mend broken minds and even restore damaged memories. The Whitmores could summon storms that defied natural law, calling down lightning that struck with supernatural precision. The Hulcom's vision pierced not just darkness, but time itself, showing them glimpses of future events. The Blackwoods learned to step between shadows, traveling vast distances instantaneously and observing anyone without being detected. But the true horror of the Compact wasn't in what they gained, but in what they became. The families discovered they were no longer entirely human. Their children were born with increasingly pronounced supernatural traits, and intermarriage between the families produced offspring with abilities that defied explanation. These hybrid bloodlines developed their own terrible gifts: the ability to speak with the dead, to see the true nature of anyone they met, to influence the dreams of entire communities, and to sense supernatural activity across hundreds of miles. The compact families to use their combined abilities to establish a criminal empire that operated completely outside the law. They controlled every aspect of life in their territory through a combination of supernatural influence and carefully orchestrated terror. Local officials were either corrupted through supernatural means or replaced with family members who had learned to disguise their otherworldly nature. The families established a network of informants that extended far beyond their mountain strongholds, using their supernatural abilities to gather intelligence that made them virtually untouchable. Their operations expanded beyond simple resource extraction. The families began trafficking in supernatural artifacts, rare minerals that held otherworldly properties, and eventually in human beings who possessed natural psychic abilities. They established underground markets where desperate people could trade years of their lives for temporary supernatural powers, creating a steady stream of souls for their otherworldly patrons. The most disturbing aspect of their business was the breeding program, where they systematically produced children with specific supernatural traits by arranging marriages between families with complementary abilities. The Civil War provided perfect cover for their most ambitious project. While the nation tore itself apart, the compact families worked to establish permanent gateways between their world and the realm of their supernatural patrons. Using the chaos of war as camouflage, they constructed a series of ritual sites connected by underground tunnels that stretched across 3 states. These sites were carefully positioned according to ley lines that had been mapped by their otherworldly allies, creating a network of supernatural power that could be activated simultaneously to achieve goals that would have been impossible for individual families. The first major test of their network came in 1863, when a Union cavalry regiment stumbled upon one of their primary ritual sites. Rather than risk exposure, the families activated their network for the first time in combat. The results were catastrophic for the soldiers. The Ashfords used their enhanced abilities to locate every piece of metal the soldiers carried, causing weapons to malfunction and equipment to fail. The Crowleys inflicted supernatural diseases that killed within hours, then raised the dead soldiers as mindless servants. The Whitmores called down a storm so violent it erased all evidence of the regiment's presence. The Hulcoms used their prophetic sight to predict every tactical move the soldiers would make, while the Blackwoods used their shadow manipulation to create illusions that drove the survivors insane. The official record states that the regiment was lost in a flash flood, but local folklore preserves darker truths. Survivors spoke of soldiers who fought against their own shadows, of weapons that turned against their wielders, of a storm that seemed to have malevolent intelligence. The families realized they had created something unprecedented, a supernatural military force that could operate with complete impunity as long as they maintained the appearance of natural disasters or ordinary criminal activity. Post-war America provided even greater opportunities for expansion. The rapid industrialization of the late 1800s created perfect cover for their supernatural resource extraction, while the massive population movements westward allowed them to establish subsidiary operations far from their original territory. Each family sent carefully selected members to establish cells in major cities where they used their supernatural abilities to gain influence in politics, finance, and industry. The Ashfords established mining operations throughout the West, using their enhanced abilities to locate precious metals that conventional prospectors missed. Their supernatural patrons guided them to veins of gold and silver that contained otherworldly properties, metals that could be forged into items with genuine magical power. The Crowleys opened medical practices in major cities, using their healing abilities to gain access to the wealthy and powerful while secretly harvesting the life force of their patients. The Whitmores became weather prophets, selling their services to shipping companies and agricultural interests while using their abilities to manipulate markets through carefully timed natural disasters. The Hulcoms established themselves as private investigators and security consultants, their supernatural vision making them incredibly effective at uncovering secrets and predicting threats. Their clients never suspected that their remarkable success rate came from abilities that allowed them to see through walls, perceive lies, and glimpse future events. The Blackwoods became the network's intelligence arm, using their shadow manipulation to spy on government officials, business leaders, and foreign dignitaries. Their ability to appear and disappear at will made them perfect for assassination and sabotage operations. By 1880, the compact families had established what amounted to a shadow government operating within the United States. They had supernatural agents in every major city, controlled vast mineral resources, and possessed intelligence networks that rivaled those of national governments. Their otherworldly patrons had grown stronger with each passing year, fed by the steady stream of souls and supernatural energy the families provided. The entities were no longer confined to the deep places of the earth, but had begun manifesting in populated areas, though always in forms that could be dismissed as natural phenomena or explained away by conventional means. The family's children were becoming increasingly inhuman with each generation. By the 1890s, some were born with abilities so pronounced they could no longer pass for normal humans. These individuals were kept in hidden facilities where they served as living weapons and sources of supernatural power. The most powerful could kill with a touch, read minds from miles away, or manipulate reality itself within limited areas. The families had created a race of supernatural beings that were technically still human, but possessed abilities that made them more dangerous than any conventional military force. The network's influence extended into every aspect of American life. They controlled newspapers that shaped public opinion, influenced elections through supernatural means, and had agents in every major industry. Their supernatural abilities gave them advantages that no conventional organization could match. They could predict market movements, control weather patterns, manipulate human behavior, and eliminate obstacles with methods that left no trace. Yet for all their power, the families were discovering that their bargains came with costs they hadn't anticipated. The entities they served were growing stronger and more demanding. What had begun as monthly offerings had escalated to weekly, then daily sacrifices. The supernatural patrons were no longer content with animal blood and human tears. They wanted souls, and not just from volunteers or enemies. They were beginning to demand the children of the families themselves, the very bloodlines that had served them so faithfully. The families found themselves trapped in a web of their own making. They had become too dependent on their supernatural abilities to function without them, but maintaining their powers required ever greater sacrifices. They had created a supernatural ecosystem where they were simultaneously the apex predators and the primary prey. Their otherworldly patrons had grown beyond their control, and the entities were beginning to make demands that threatened the very existence of the families that had served them for generations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the five families, but the balance between the natural and supernatural worlds. By the 1850s, these five bloodlines had established themselves as more than mere mountain families. They had become something unprecedented in American history, a shadow aristocracy operating beyond the reach of law, their influence extending far beyond their Appalachian strongholds. What began as desperate bargains in isolated hollows had evolved into a sophisticated network that would reshape the very foundations of American power. The Civil War provided the perfect cover for the families to expand their operations. While the nation tore itself apart, the Ashfords, Crowleys, Whitmores, Hulcoms, and Blackwoods quietly positioned themselves as essential suppliers to both Union and Confederate forces. Their supernatural advantages made them invaluable. The Ashfords could divine enemy troop movements through their otherworldly patrons. The Crowleys' alchemical knowledge produced medicines and poisons that decided battles. The Whitmores used their influence over natural forces to control weather patterns, ensuring their crops flourished while enemy supplies rotted in the fields. But it was during Reconstruction that their true genius revealed itself. As the federal government struggled to rebuild the South, these families had already established themselves as the invisible infrastructure of American commerce. They owned banks that never failed, railroads that never faced labor disputes, and factories that never suffered catastrophic accidents. Their success defied logic, but those who investigated too closely found themselves facing career ruin, mysterious illnesses, or worse. The transformation of their descendants became more pronounced with each generation. Children born into these bloodlines displayed abilities that would have been considered miraculous in any other context. They could sense deception with uncanny accuracy, predict market fluctuations with supernatural precision, and command loyalty from complete strangers through means that couldn't be explained by charisma alone. Their physical appearances began to reflect their otherworldly connections. Eyes that seemed to hold depths no human gaze should contain, skin that remained unmarked by age or injury, voices that carried undertones of authority that made listeners comply without understanding why. The entities they served grew more demanding as the family's power increased. What had once been monthly rituals became weekly obligations. The blood offerings that had satisfied their patrons for decades were no longer sufficient. The otherworldly beings craved more complex tributes, memories, dreams, and eventually human souls. The families found themselves caught in an escalating cycle of supernatural dependency. Each generation required to provide greater sacrifices to maintain their predecessors' bargains. The Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s provided new opportunities for the families to expand their influence. They were among the first to invest in steel production, petroleum extraction, and electrical power generation. Their supernatural insights allowed them to anticipate technological developments decades before their competitors. When oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, the Hulcoms already owned drilling rights to the most productive fields. When steel became the backbone of American industry, the Ashfords controlled the most efficient foundries. Every major technological advancement seemed to benefit these families disproportionately. Their political influence grew in tandem with their economic power. By the 1880s, members of these bloodlines held positions in state governments, federal agencies, and even the military. They never sought the highest offices, understanding that true power operated best from the shadows. Instead, they cultivated networks of influence that spanned every level of government. A judge here, a senator there, a general in the right position. Their web of control was so subtle that even those within it rarely understood the full scope of their manipulation. The family's business enterprises began to reflect their supernatural nature in ways that careful observers found deeply unsettling. Factories, some owned by the Crowleys, operated with impossible efficiency, their machinery rarely breaking down, and their workers showing unusual dedication despite dangerous conditions. The Whitmore shipping empire never lost a vessel to storms, even during the most treacherous seasons. Investors in Hulcom mining operations saw returns that defied every principle of sound business practice, yet the profits continued to flow. The cost of maintaining these advantages became increasingly visible in the families themselves. Each generation bore more pronounced physical and mental abnormalities. Children were born with additional fingers, teeth that grew in unusual patterns, or eyes that reflected light, like those of nocturnal predators. Their lifespans, while extended beyond normal human limits, were marked by periodic episodes of violent illness, during which they would speak in languages that scholars couldn't identify and display knowledge of events occurring thousands of miles away. The families developed elaborate protocols for managing these supernatural afflictions. They established private medical facilities staffed by physicians who had been carefully selected for their discretion and willingness to ignore conventional medical wisdom. These doctors learned to treat conditions that existed in no medical textbook: blood that occasionally turned silver, bones that grew in impossible configurations, and minds that could access memories from previous generations of the bloodline. As the 19th century drew to a close, the families faced a new challenge. The entities they served began to manifest more directly in the physical world. What had once been whispered communications and subtle influences became increasingly overt supernatural phenomena. Family estates experienced unexplained architectural changes overnight. Rooms would appear that hadn't existed the previous day, containing furniture and decorations that seemed to predate human civilization. Servants reported seeing figures moving through the houses that cast no shadows and left no footprints. The family's business records from this period, those few that survived, reveal a pattern of expansion that defied economic logic. They invested in projects that seemed doomed to failure, yet invariably succeeded. A railroad line through impassable terrain would mysteriously find natural passages that surveyors had missed. A factory built on unstable ground would never experience foundation problems. Their success became so consistent that other businessmen began to whisper about supernatural intervention. The academic community of the late 1800s included several researchers who attempted to study these families' remarkable success. Professor Malcolm Whitmore of Harvard University, no relation to the Appalachian Whitmores, spent 3 years investigating what he termed anomalous prosperity patterns among certain American business dynasties. His research notes, discovered in university archives decades later, described statistical impossibilities in the family's success rates. His final journal entry, dated November 15, 1897, read simply, "The mathematics of their success violates every principle of probability." Professor Whitmore was found dead in his study 3 days later, apparently from a heart attack, though he was only 38 years old and had no history of cardiac problems. His research materials disappeared from the university archives, and his ongoing studies were quietly discontinued. The family's influence on American culture extended beyond business and politics. They became patrons of the arts, but their support came with subtle conditions that shaped the creative works they funded. Painters who accepted their patronage found their work taking on themes of darkness and otherworldly beauty. Musicians composed pieces that seemed to induce unusual emotional states in listeners. Writers produced literature that explored themes of supernatural horror with disturbing authenticity. The turn of the century brought new challenges, as the family's activities attracted attention from an unexpected source, other practitioners of the occult. European occultists, drawn by rumors of American families who had achieved unprecedented success through supernatural means, began arriving in the United States to study their methods. These investigators found themselves facing a level of supernatural organization and power that exceeded anything documented in European magical traditions. The families responded to this scrutiny by establishing what they called the Inner Circle, a coordinating body that managed their collective interests and ensured their continued secrecy. The Inner Circle met quarterly at a location that rotated among the family's properties, conducting business in chambers that had been specially prepared to prevent supernatural surveillance. These meetings addressed not only practical matters of business coordination, but also the increasingly complex requirements of their otherworldly patrons. The entity's demands had evolved beyond simple offerings of blood and soul. They now required the families to facilitate specific historical events, to ensure that certain individuals rose to positions of power while others were eliminated, and to gradually reshape American society according to patterns that served their mysterious purposes. The families found themselves becoming instruments of forces whose ultimate goals remained hidden even from their most devoted servants. By 1900, the 5 bloodlines controlled an estimated 12% of American industrial capacity and held influence over political decisions that affected millions of lives. Their supernatural advantages had transformed them from desperate mountain families into a shadow government that operated parallel to the official structures of American democracy. Yet their power came at a cost that was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. The entities they served were no longer content to remain in the shadows, and the barriers between worlds were growing thinner with each passing year. The bargains struck in those early years were just the beginning. By the late 1800s, the 5 families had discovered something that would transform their operations forever. They were not alone in their communion with the ancient forces dwelling beneath the Appalachian peaks. Other bloodlines across the mountain ranges had made similar exchanges, creating a vast network of supernatural allegiance that stretched from the Carolinas to the Ohio River Valley. The revelation came during the harsh winter of 1893 when a traveling merchant named Cornelius Vance arrived at the Ashford compound carrying more than just trade goods. Hidden beneath bolts of fabric and farming tools, his wagon contained artifacts that made the Ashford patriarch's blood run cold. Bone carvings identical to those his grandfather had described from the original ritual, silver amulets bearing symbols that matched the markings that appeared on Ashford children at birth. Most disturbing of all, a leather-bound ledger containing detailed records of families across 7 states, all bound by similar covenants, all owing tribute to entities that demanded increasing payments as their influence grew. Vance himself was no ordinary merchant. His elongated fingers ended in nails that curved like talons. His eyes held depths that seemed to contain swirling darkness, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated from somewhere deep within his chest. He claimed to represent what he called the convergence, a confederation of bloodlines that had been orchestrating events across the American frontier for generations. The entities they served, he explained, were not separate beings, but fragments of something vast and ancient that had been dormant beneath the mountains since before human memory. The Ashfords learned that their mining success, the Crowleys' political connections, the Whitmore's industrial empire, the Hulcom's agricultural dominance, and the Blackwood's occult knowledge were all pieces of a larger design. Each family had been granted powers that complemented the others, creating a shadow infrastructure that could operate across multiple spheres of influence. The entities had been patient, nurturing their chosen bloodlines across decades, preparing for a time when their fragmented consciousness could begin to reunite. Vance delivered invitations to what he called the First Conclave, a gathering scheduled for the winter solstice of 1893 at a location he would reveal only to the family patriarchs. The meeting would take place in neutral territory, at a site where the barriers between worlds had grown thin enough to allow direct communication with their benefactors. Attendance, he made clear, was not optional. The entities had grown tired of managing their investments separately and were ready to coordinate their efforts toward a common goal. The location revealed itself to be a natural amphitheater hidden deep within the Allegheny Mountains, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by standing stones that predated any known civilization. Representatives from 17 families arrived through treacherous mountain passes, each group accompanied by wagons loaded with tribute. The Ashfords brought rare metals extracted from their deepest mines. The Crowleys offered political intelligence gathered from their network of corrupted officials. The Whitmores provided blueprints for industrial machinery that could be adapted for purposes beyond conventional manufacturing. At the center of the amphitheater, a massive fire burned with flames that cast no warmth but seemed to draw light from the surrounding darkness. The assembled families arranged themselves in concentric circles around this unnatural pyre, with the most powerful bloodlines closest to the center. As midnight approached, the fire began to pulse in rhythm with what sounded like a massive heartbeat emanating from somewhere deep underground. What emerged from the flames was not a single entity, but a collective consciousness that spoke through multiple voices simultaneously. It addressed each family by name, recounting their individual bargains and accomplishments with intimate detail. The entities revealed themselves as aspects of something they called the progenitor, an ancient intelligence that had been imprisoned beneath the mountains eons ago by forces that no longer existed to maintain their vigilance. The progenitor's plan was elegant in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The families would continue their expansion, but now with coordinated purpose. The Ashfords would extend their mining operations to create a network of tunnels that would eventually connect sacred sites across the mountain range. The Crowleys would manipulate political processes to ensure that government oversight remained minimal and that certain territories remained protected from development. The Whitmores would establish manufacturing facilities that could produce specialized equipment needed for larger rituals. Most importantly, the families would begin systematic intermarriage, not among themselves, but with carefully selected individuals from outside their bloodlines. The entities had identified specific genetic markers that, when combined with their enhanced bloodlines, would produce offspring capable of serving as vessels for more direct manifestation. These children would appear normal to outside observers, but would possess abilities that far exceeded what their parents had achieved. The convergence established strict protocols for these breeding programs. Potential mates were identified through a network of agents who monitored genealogical records, medical histories, and even physical characteristics across multiple states. Courtship was orchestrated through seemingly natural encounters, with the chosen individuals never suspecting that their romantic connections had been predetermined by supernatural design. The first generation of these planned unions produced remarkable results. Children born from these matches demonstrated abilities that their parents had never possessed: telepathic communication over vast distances, the capacity to influence weather patterns, immunity to diseases that ravaged normal populations, and most significantly, the ability to perceive and interact with entities that remained invisible to others. By 1905, the network had expanded to include over 40 families across 12 states, each specializing in different aspects of the progenitor's grand design. The Kellermans of Pennsylvania controlled canal and railroad systems, ensuring that materials and personnel could move undetected across vast distances. The Harrowells of Virginia had infiltrated religious organizations, gradually corrupting doctrine to prepare congregations for eventual revelation. The Blackthorn family of Kentucky had established a network of schools and libraries, carefully editing historical records to obscure evidence of their activities while preserving knowledge that would be needed for future operations. The Industrial Revolution provided perfect cover for their expanding operations. Coal mines offered access to deep, underground chambers where major rituals could be conducted without detection. Steel mills provided materials for constructing artifacts that could channel supernatural energies. Railroad networks enabled rapid transportation of both personnel and materials across the continent. Telegraph systems allowed for coded communication that appeared to be routine business correspondence. The families developed increasingly sophisticated methods for maintaining their secrecy. They established legitimate businesses that generated genuine profits, making their wealth appear entirely natural. They created charitable foundations that provided real benefits to local communities, earning goodwill that deflected suspicion. They even established their own newspapers and publishing houses, controlling information flow in regions where they operated. Most ingeniously, they began deliberately cultivating local legends and folklore that painted them as eccentric but ultimately harmless mountain families. Stories of moonshine operations, family feuds, and backwards rural customs provided perfect camouflage for activities that would have terrified anyone who understood their true nature. Visitors to their territories encountered carefully orchestrated performances of rustic simplicity, never suspecting that they were being observed by individuals whose capabilities far exceeded anything found in the world's most advanced cities. The children produced by their breeding programs were raised according to strict protocols designed to maximize their potential while maintaining their cover. They received conventional educations supplemented by private tutoring in subjects that no university taught. They learned to speak multiple languages, including several that were not entirely human in origin. They studied mathematics, as chemistry, and physics alongside disciplines that conventional science refused to acknowledge. By adolescence, these enhanced bloodlines demonstrated capabilities that would have been considered miraculous in earlier eras. They could influence human behavior through subtle psychological manipulation, predict weather patterns with supernatural accuracy, and most remarkably, commune directly with the entities that had empowered their families without requiring elaborate rituals or sacred locations. The entities, meanwhile, had been growing stronger with each passing year. The regular tribute and expanding network of worshippers had allowed them to extend their influence far beyond their original mountain strongholds. They could now manifest in multiple locations simultaneously, coordinate activities across vast distances, and even influence events in major cities through their human agents. The approach of the 20th century brought new opportunities and new challenges. The modern world offered unprecedented possibilities for expanding their operations, but it also brought increased scrutiny from government agencies and scientific institutions that might pose threats to their secrecy. The entities demanded that their human servants adapt to these changing conditions while accelerating their ultimate objective, the complete manifestation of the progenitor in the physical world. The stage was set for the most ambitious phase of their centuries-long plan. The families had accumulated wealth, political influence, and supernatural power beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. Their enhanced bloodlines had produced individuals capable of serving as conduits for forces that could reshape reality itself. The network of tunnels, facilities, and sacred sites was nearing completion. All that remained was the final convergence, when the scattered fragments of the progenitor would unite through their human vessels and reclaim dominion over a world that had forgotten the true nature of the powers sleeping beneath the ancient mountains. As the 1960s dawned, the shadow network that had taken root in America's hidden corners began to reveal its true scope. What had started as desperate bargains in remote mountain hollows had evolved into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. The 5 families, now spanning multiple generations, had learned to operate in perfect coordination, their ancient pacts deepening into something that resembled a collective consciousness. The Ashford banking empire had quietly acquired controlling interests in 17 regional banks across 6 states. Their supernatural ability to predict market fluctuations, granted by their blood covenant, allowed them to manipulate entire economic systems with surgical precision. But the cost was becoming impossible to hide. Every Ashford child born after 1955 exhibited the same disturbing trait. They aged at half the normal rate until their 13th birthday, then rapidly accelerated, reaching physical maturity within months. Medical examinations revealed their blood contained microscopic crystalline structures that pulsed with their heartbeat, as though something alien was integrating with their very life force. The entity bound to the Ashford bloodline, known in their private journals as the accountant, had begun making increasingly specific demands. Monthly blood offerings were no longer sufficient. The creature required what it called economic sacrifices, deliberate market crashes that would destroy the livelihoods of thousands while enriching the Ashford holdings. Each financial catastrophe they orchestrated fed something vast and hungry that existed between the numbers in their ledgers. Meanwhile, the Crowley industrial dynasty had perfected their control over manufacturing across the Ohio River Valley. Their factories produced goods with an efficiency that defied explanation, their workers displaying an almost hypnotic dedication to their tasks. But employees who worked in Crowley facilities for more than 3 years began exhibiting strange behavioral changes. They spoke in unison during meetings, their movements becoming synchronized, their personal relationships dissolving as they became increasingly devoted to the company. The entity that had empowered the Crowleys demanded what they termed productive essence, the creative spark that drove human innovation and ambition. Workers would arrive at Crowley facilities as bright, motivated individuals and leave as hollow shells who performed their duties with mechanical precision. The stolen essence was fed to something the family called the engine, a presence that existed within every piece of machinery they operated. The Whitmore political network had infiltrated government at every level, from small-town mayors to federal bureaucrats. Their supernatural charisma and ability to influence human behavior made them natural power brokers. By 1962, they had placed family members or loyal associates in key positions throughout the legislative and judicial branches. Their entity, referred to only as the voice, granted them the ability to speak words that bypassed rational thought and implanted suggestions directly into the subconscious mind. But the voice's hunger was perhaps the most insidious of all. It fed on democratic participation itself, gradually eroding the public's faith in their own government. Each Whitmore manipulation, each corrupted election, each backroom deal served to strengthen their patron entity while weakening the very foundations of American democracy. The voice whispered that representative government was merely an illusion, that true power belonged to those willing to embrace the darkness between the votes. The Hulcom medical establishment had grown into a network of hospitals, research facilities, and pharmaceutical companies that spanned the eastern seaboard. Their supernatural diagnostic abilities and miraculous treatments had earned them recognition as pioneers in modern medicine. But their success came at a horrific price. The entity they served, known as the physician, demanded payment in suffering itself. Hulcom facilities deliberately misdiagnosed healthy patients, subjecting them to unnecessary procedures that generated both profit and the pain their patron required. Their research divisions conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics, using unwitting subjects to test treatments that were designed not to heal, but to harvest specific types of anguish. The physician had explained that human suffering, properly refined, could be transformed into a substance that bridged the gap between dimensions. The Blackwood occult network had evolved beyond their original mountain strongholds into a sophisticated organization that operated through exclusive clubs, secret societies, and academic institutions. They had established chapters in major universities where they recruited brilliant minds to serve their cause. Their entity, the progenitor, had revealed itself to be not merely a creature seeking power, but an ancient intelligence that had been imprisoned beneath the Appalachian mountains for millennia. The progenitor's ultimate goal was not domination, but manifestation, the complete merger of its realm with physical reality. Each ritual performed by the Blackwood network weakened the barriers between worlds, allowing more of the entity's essence to seep into our dimension. The other family's entities were revealed to be fragments of this greater consciousness, aspects of the progenitor that had been sent ahead to prepare for its eventual emergence. By 1965, the 5 families had begun coordinating their activities with unprecedented precision. The Ashfords would orchestrate economic instability that drove desperate people to seek employment at Crowley facilities. The Crowleys would drain these workers of their essence while funneling profits to Whitmore political campaigns. The Whitmores would pass legislation that expanded Hulcom medical authority while reducing oversight of their practices. The Hulcoms would use their influence to suppress investigations into unexplained phenomena, particularly those occurring near Blackwood sites. The Blackwoods, meanwhile, had discovered that the entities required not just individual sacrifices, but coordinated offerings that spanned multiple states simultaneously. They began orchestrating what they called convergence events, carefully planned incidents that would generate massive amounts of fear, desperation, and suffering across wide geographic areas. Industrial accidents, political scandals, medical crises, and financial collapses were timed to occur in sequence, creating waves of negative emotion that fed the growing presence beneath the mountains. Each family had also begun implementing breeding programs designed to create optimal vessels for their patron entities. Marriage contracts were arranged not for love or political alliance, but for genetic compatibility with supernatural forces. Children were tested from birth for their ability to channel otherworldly energies, with those showing the strongest connection being groomed for leadership roles within the network. The most disturbing development was the emergence of what the families called the hybrid generation. These were children born after 1960 whose exposure to the entities had begun in utero. They displayed abilities that went far beyond their parents' supernatural gifts. Some could perceive events occurring hundreds of miles away. Others could influence electronics and machinery through thought alone, and a few seemed to exist partially in both dimensions simultaneously. These hybrid children reported shared dreams where they communicated with the progenitor directly. The entity had begun teaching them a new language, one that existed as much in gesture and intent as in spoken words. When they used this language together, reality itself seemed to bend around them. Objects would appear and disappear, wounds would heal instantly, and the boundary between thought and physical manifestation would blur. The families realized they were approaching what the progenitor called the final convergence, a moment when enough of its essence would be present in our world to complete its manifestation. The entity had revealed that this process required not just the accumulated power of 5 bloodlines, but the willing participation of an entire population. The decades of economic manipulation, political corruption, medical exploitation, and occult influence had all been preparation for this ultimate goal. The progenitor's plan was elegant in its scope. By controlling the economic, political, medical, and spiritual infrastructure of American society, the families had created a system where millions of people would voluntarily surrender their autonomy when the moment arrived. Economic desperation would drive them to accept any employment offered. Political disillusionment would make them grateful for any leader who promised stability. Medical dependency would ensure they accepted any treatment prescribed, and spiritual emptiness would leave them vulnerable to any ideology that offered meaning. When the final convergence began, the progenitor would simultaneously inhabit every person who had been prepared by the network. The entity would not rule humanity. It would become humanity, experiencing existence through millions of host bodies while maintaining its singular consciousness. The families would serve as its primary vessels, their bloodlines carrying the concentrated essence of its will. But the progenitor's hunger was proving more demanding than even the families had anticipated. The entity had begun requiring sacrifices on a scale that risked exposing the entire network. Industrial accidents were becoming too frequent to dismiss as coincidence. Political assassinations were drawing federal attention. Medical facilities were facing investigations that threatened to uncover their true purpose. And occult activities were leaving physical evidence that even sympathetic authorities couldn't ignore. The families found themselves caught between their patrons' escalating demands and the need to maintain their cover. Some members began questioning whether they had unleashed something beyond their control. Others argued that they had come too far to turn back, that the only safety lay in completing the convergence before their activities were fully exposed. As 1968 approached, the network faced its greatest challenge yet. The entity beneath the mountains was stirring, its influence growing stronger with each passing month. The hybrid children were beginning to manifest abilities that couldn't be hidden from the outside world. And somewhere in the depths of the federal government, investigators were starting to piece together connections between seemingly unrelated incidents across multiple states. The families had built their shadow empire over generations, but the progenitor's awakening was accelerating beyond their carefully laid plans. The entity's hunger was becoming insatiable, its demands threatening to consume not just their victims, but the very civilization they had worked so hard to infiltrate and control. The final convergence was approaching, and with it, a transformation that would reshape the very nature of human existence. The question was no longer whether the families could complete their ancient pact, but whether they could survive the fulfillment of their deepest desires. The convergence was accelerating. By the mid-1970s, the supernatural network forged by the 5 families had evolved into something far more sophisticated and terrifying than their founders could have imagined. What began as desperate bargains in isolated hollows, had metastasized into a vast underground empire spanning continents, with tendrils reaching into every corner of American society. The modern era brought new challenges and opportunities for the bloodline families. The Ashfords that had seamlessly transitioned from mining fortunes to technology empires, their supernatural insights allowing them to anticipate market shifts decades in advance. Silicon Valley's rise wasn't coincidental. Several key tech companies traced their founding capital to Ashford shell corporations. The family's descendants, now bearing subtle but unmistakable marks of their otherworldly heritage, possessed an uncanny ability to predict technological trends and consumer behavior that bordered on precognition. Marcus Ashford, great-grandson of the original patriarch, stood at the helm of 3 Fortune 500 companies by 1983. His boardroom strategies were legendary for their ruthless precision, though few knew that every major decision was preceded by midnight consultations in the family's private chambers. The entities that had once demanded simple blood offerings now required far more complex tributes. Corporate takeovers weren't merely business ventures. They were carefully orchestrated rituals designed to concentrate power and influence according to specifications whispered from beyond the veil. The Crowley banking dynasty had evolved into something even more insidious. Their financial networks now controlled currency flows across 17 nations, with the ability to trigger economic collapses or booms through seemingly routine transactions. Eleanor Crowley, the family's current matriarch, had established what appeared to be a legitimate investment fund that managed pension funds for millions of Americans. What those investors didn't know was that their life savings were being used as collateral in transactions with entities that existed outside conventional reality. The supernatural stock market that Victoria Crowley had discovered in 1923 had grown exponentially. By 1980, it encompassed not just financial instruments, but human experiences, emotions, and even memories. The Crowleys could literally trade in fear, hope, despair, and joy, harvesting these emotions from unsuspecting populations and converting them into power that their otherworldly patrons craved. Economic recessions weren't just market corrections. They were deliberate harvesting periods where human suffering was concentrated and channeled into the shadow economy that operated parallel to the mundane world. The Whitmore political machine had become a masterpiece of hidden influence. 3 generations of strategic marriages and carefully planted protégés had created a network of political operatives that spanned both major parties. Senator David Whitmore, great-nephew of the original family head, chaired the Senate Intelligence Committee, while his cousin Rebecca held a key position in the Department of Energy. Their influence wasn't limited to elected officials. They had cultivated relationships with career bureaucrats, military officers, and intelligence operatives who unknowingly served the family's agenda. The entities that had initially promised political power now demanded something far more significant. They wanted access to the levers of government itself, not just for influence, but for transformation. The Whitmores had spent decades gradually shifting policies and procedures, creating legal frameworks that would facilitate what they called the Great Opening. Immigration policies, environmental regulations, even building codes were subtly modified to align with requirements that served purposes beyond human comprehension. Most disturbing was the family's role in what appeared to be random government decisions. The location of military bases, the routing of interstate highways, the placement of federal buildings, all followed patterns that became clear only when viewed from the perspective of otherworldly geometry. The United States infrastructure was being gradually reshaped into a massive ritual circle, with key installations serving as focal points for energies that defied conventional understanding. The Hulcom industrial empire had grown into a conglomerate that controlled manufacturing, shipping, and logistics across multiple sectors. Their factories produced everything from consumer electronics to military equipment, but each facility served a dual purpose. Production lines were arranged according to specifications that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with channeling supernatural forces. Workers reported strange dreams after shifts, recurring nightmares of vast mechanical entities that spoke in the rhythm of assembly lines. The family's shipping network had become a critical component of the supernatural infrastructure. Cargo containers moved between ports, carrying more than just commercial goods. Ancient artifacts, ritual components, and things that existed in quantum states between dimensions were transported through legitimate commercial channels. Port authorities in 17 countries had been compromised, their inspection procedures modified to ensure that certain shipments passed through without scrutiny. The Hulcom factories had become manufacturing centers for objects that served the entity's purposes. Consumer products embedded with microscopic symbols that influenced human behavior were distributed to millions of households. Electronic devices contained components that functioned as receivers for transmissions from realms beyond normal perception. The family had weaponized mass production, turning everyday objects into instruments of subtle influence and control. The Blackwood media empire had evolved into something unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. By 1985, they controlled television networks, radio stations, publishing houses, and early cable systems that reached into nearly every American home. Their content wasn't just entertainment, it was psychological conditioning on a massive scale. Television programs contained subliminal elements that prepared viewers for concepts that would have been rejected as impossible just decades earlier. The family's research division had developed techniques for embedding supernatural influences into electronic media. Television broadcasts carried more than audio and video signals. They transmitted frequencies that resonated with specific areas of the human brain, gradually altering perception and making viewers more susceptible to otherworldly influence. The rise of cable television wasn't just technological progress, it was the deployment of a delivery system for consciousness modification on an unprecedented scale. Movies and television shows produced by Blackwood subsidiaries followed patterns that served ritual purposes. Popular entertainment became a form of mass ceremony, with millions of viewers unknowingly participating in ritual activities through their consumption of carefully crafted content. The entities that had once demanded personal sacrifices from individual families now fed on the collective emotional energy of entire populations gathered around their television sets. The convergence of these 5 power centers created a shadow government that operated alongside and within the official structures of American democracy. Policy decisions that appeared to emerge from normal political processes were actually the result of coordination between supernatural entities and their human servants. The Cold War itself had been partially orchestrated to maintain the tension and fear that certain entities required for sustenance. By the 1980s, the families had begun implementing what they called the final phase. The entities that had patiently cultivated human civilization for over a century were ready to emerge from the shadows. The infrastructure was in place, the population had been psychologically prepared, and the barriers between dimensions had been systematically weakened through decades of ritual activity. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to look. Unusual weather patterns weren't just climate change, they were the result of atmospheric manipulation designed to create conditions favorable for otherworldly manifestation. The rise of personal computers wasn't just technological advancement, it was the deployment of a global nervous system that could be used to coordinate supernatural activities across vast distances. The families themselves had evolved far beyond their original human forms. Generations of supernatural influence had created bloodlines that were more entity than human. Their children were born with abilities that defied scientific explanation. Their lifespans extended far beyond normal human limits. Their consciousness expanded to encompass perceptions that spanned multiple dimensions simultaneously. The cost of this transformation was becoming apparent. The entities that had once been content with periodic offerings now demanded constant tribute. Human sacrifice had become routine, though it was disguised as everything from industrial accidents to random violence. The families had established networks of disposal sites, ritual chambers, and processing facilities that operated behind the facades of legitimate businesses. More disturbing was the revelation that the entities weren't just alien intelligences seeking to dominate humanity. They were the original inhabitants of Earth, ancient consciousnesses that had been displaced by the rise of human civilization. The supernatural network wasn't an invasion, it was a reclamation project. The entities were using their human servants to restore conditions that had existed before humanity's emergence, preparing the planet for their return to physical manifestation. The families had become willing participants in the extinction of their own species. The wealth, power, and influence they had gained were temporary privileges granted in exchange for their role in facilitating humanity's replacement. The entities had played a long game, using human ambition and desperation to create the very instruments of human destruction. As the 1980s progressed, the boundaries between the mundane and supernatural worlds continued to blur. Reality itself was becoming unstable, with increasing reports of phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional science. The family's activities had created tears in the fabric of existence, allowing energies and entities from other dimensions to seep into the physical world. The network they had built was no longer under their control. The entities that had once been their patrons had become their masters, and the masters were preparing for the final act of a drama that had been unfolding for over a century. By the mid-20th century, what had begun as desperate bargains in remote Appalachian hollows had evolved into something far more sinister. The five bloodlines weren't just maintaining their supernatural agreements anymore. They were actively working to fulfill them. The entities beneath the mountains had been patient for generations, feeding on the offerings, growing stronger with each ritual, each birth, each death. But patience, even for ancient beings, eventually runs thin. The first sign that something fundamental was shifting came in 1962 when children across 3 states began drawing the same symbol in school notebooks. Teachers who noticed the pattern quickly realized these weren't random doodles. The symbol appeared in the artwork of students who had never met, lived hundreds of miles apart, and attended different schools. When child psychologists investigated, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Every child who drew the symbol came from families with historical connections to the original 5 bloodlines, even if those connections had been forgotten or deliberately obscured. The symbol itself defied easy description. It resembled a tree with roots that extended downward into spiraling patterns, but the branches reached in directions that seemed to violate perspective. When viewed directly, it appeared almost normal, but peripheral vision revealed movement within the lines, as though something was shifting just beneath the surface of the drawing. Most disturbing of all, the children couldn't explain why they drew it. They simply felt compelled to put pencil to paper, their hands moving with practiced precision to create something they claimed never to have seen before. Dr. Margaret Hillcrest, a psychiatrist studying the phenomenon, documented her findings in a report that was immediately classified by federal authorities. In her final notes, she wrote, "The children describe hearing whispers while they draw, voices speaking in harmony about the approaching convergence. They don't understand the words, but they feel the emotion behind them, anticipation, hunger, and something else that chills me to write down." The second sign emerged in 1971 when geological surveys across Appalachia began detecting unusual seismic activity. Unlike typical earthquakes, these tremors followed no known fault lines. Instead, they originated from depths that shouldn't have been geologically active, creating rhythmic pulses that seismologists described as resembling a massive heartbeat. The epicenters of these tremors consistently aligned with locations where the original families had first encountered the entities decades earlier. Government scientists initially dismissed the patterns as coincidence, but as the frequency and intensity increased, denial became impossible. The tremors weren't random geological events. They were synchronized across vast distances, creating a network of underground activity that spanned multiple states. Even more troubling, the rhythm was accelerating. What had begun as pulses occurring every few months had increased to weekly, then daily occurrences. Mining operations in affected areas reported strange phenomena. Equipment would malfunction in ways that defied explanation, with sophisticated machinery reassembling itself into configurations that were more efficient than their original designs. Deep shafts that had been sealed for decades were found mysteriously reopened, their interiors carved with symbols that matched the drawings appearing in children's notebooks. Most unsettling of all, miners working in the deepest tunnels reported hearing sounds that seemed to come from below their feet. Not the grinding of rock or the settling of earth, but something that resembled breathing. The third sign appeared in 1983 when television and radio broadcasts across the mountain regions began experiencing systematic interference. The disruptions weren't random static or equipment failure. They were coordinated insertions of content that shouldn't have existed. During regular programming, viewers would suddenly hear fragments of conversations in languages that linguists couldn't identify. The voices were discussing preparations, speaking of vessels, and timing and the approach of something they called the Great Awakening. These broadcasts lasted only seconds, but they occurred with increasing frequency. Local stations couldn't explain the source of the interference. Their equipment showed no signs of tampering, and the signals appeared to be originating from within the broadcast systems themselves. Federal Communications Commission investigators discovered that the interference was being generated by transmitters that didn't exist on any official records, devices that somehow integrated seamlessly with existing broadcast infrastructure. The content of these mysterious transmissions grew more specific over time. Instead of fragmentary conversations, they began broadcasting what sounded like instructional material. Listeners reported hearing detailed descriptions of rituals, genealogical information about specific family lines, and coordinates for locations deep within the mountains. Some broadcasts included what appeared to be recruitment messages, speaking directly to individuals by name and providing them with specific meeting times and places. By 1987, the pattern had become undeniable. The entities weren't just passively waiting for their agreements to be fulfilled. They were actively orchestrating events, using the descendants of the original 5 families as instruments in a larger symphony of preparation. The symbols drawn by children weren't random compulsions. They were blueprints, architectural plans for structures that began appearing in remote locations throughout the mountains. These structures defied conventional understanding of construction. They appeared overnight in areas where no heavy machinery could have operated, built from materials that didn't match any known geological formations in the region. The buildings themselves seemed to follow the same impossible geometry as the symbols, with angles that hurt to look at directly, and spaces that appeared larger inside than their external dimensions should have allowed. Local authorities who investigated these structures reported experiencing severe psychological effects. Sheriff's deputies would enter the buildings for routine inspections and emerge hours later with no memory of what they had seen inside. Some officers resigned immediately after these encounters, refusing to discuss their experiences. Others continued their duties, but displayed personality changes that concerned their families and colleagues. The most disturbing discovery came when researchers realized that the locations of these structures formed a pattern when viewed from above. They weren't randomly distributed across the landscape. They were positioned at specific coordinates that, when connected, created a massive version of the symbol the children had been drawing. The mountains themselves were being transformed into a ritual space of unprecedented scale. The 4th sign manifested in 1994 when missing persons reports across the region began following a specific pattern. The disappearances weren't random crimes or accidents. They were systematically targeting individuals from families with historical connections to the original bloodlines. Even more troubling, the missing people weren't vanishing permanently. They were returning after periods ranging from days to months, but they came back changed. Family members reported that their loved ones possessed knowledge they shouldn't have had, spoke of places they had never visited, and demonstrated abilities that defied explanation. Some returnees could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Others displayed perfect recall of events that had occurred decades before their birth. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be aware of things happening in distant locations, as though they were connected to some vast network of consciousness. Medical examinations of the returnees revealed physical changes that doctors couldn't explain. Their brain scans showed unusual activity in regions associated with sensory processing, as though they were receiving information through channels beyond the normal five senses. Blood tests revealed the presence of compounds that didn't match any known biological markers. Most unsettling of all, the returnees' genetic profiles showed subtle alterations that suggested their DNA had been modified at the molecular level. The returnees themselves were reluctant to discuss their experiences, but fragmentary accounts painted a picture of systematic preparation. They spoke of underground chambers where they had been instructed in rituals and shown visions of the future. They described entities that didn't possess fixed physical forms, but appeared as shifting amalgamations of shadow and substance. Most significantly, they conveyed a sense of impending culmination, as though decades of preparation were approaching their intended conclusion. By 1998, the signs had converged into an unmistakable pattern. The entities beneath the mountains were no longer content to work through individual families pursuing separate agendas. They had begun coordinating their efforts using the descendants of the original bloodlines as components in a vast mechanism designed to facilitate their emergence into the physical world. The bargains struck by desperate families in the 19th century had been down payments on a debt that was now coming due. The seismic activity had intensified to the point where it was affecting infrastructure across multiple states. The mysterious broadcasts had evolved into a constant stream of coordination signals, directing the movements of individuals who seemed to be operating under some form of external control. The impossible structures had multiplied until they formed a network spanning hundreds of miles, their combined presence creating electromagnetic anomalies that were visible from space. Most ominously, the returnees had begun gathering in specific locations, drawn by compulsions they couldn't explain or resist. These gatherings weren't random social events. They were rehearsals, practice sessions for rituals that would require the participation of hundreds of individuals working in perfect coordination. The entities were preparing for something unprecedented, an event that would require the combined efforts of all five bloodlines and their accumulated power. The final sign appeared in 2001 when satellite imagery revealed that the network of structures had achieved its intended configuration. The massive symbol carved into the landscape through decades of construction was complete. The underground chambers were fully prepared. The bloodline descendants had been positioned at their designated coordinates. The entities had finished their preparations and were ready to begin the final phase of their emergence. What had begun as individual family tragedies in remote mountain hollows had evolved into a coordinated effort spanning multiple generations and involving thousands of unknowing participants. The entities weren't just ancient beings seeking to return to the surface world. They were architects of transformation, working to remake reality itself according to their vision. The mountains that had hidden their presence for so long were about to become the stage for their greatest performance. The convergence was no longer a distant possibility. By the 1880s, the five families had discovered what they thought was their greatest achievement: the ability to coordinate their separate powers into something far more potent than the sum of their parts. What began as isolated pacts with ancient entities had evolved into an interconnected web of supernatural influence that spanned entire regions of Appalachia. The convergence started with seemingly innocent encounters. Ashford children began appearing at Crowley healing ceremonies, drawn by whispers they claimed to hear in their dreams. Whitmore timber operations mysteriously expanded into territories adjacent to Hulcom mining claims, their boundaries meeting at precise points that formed geometric patterns visible only from great heights. Blackwood members started attending the same remote churches as scattered representatives from the other families, sitting in pews arranged in configurations that matched symbols found carved into trees throughout their separate territories. By 1892, the families had established what they called the Confluence, a gathering held every winter solstice at a location that rotated between their territories. The first documented meeting occurred in a natural amphitheater deep within Blackwood lands, where representatives from each family brought offerings that complemented rather than competed with each other. The Ashfords contributed their enhanced intuition, able to sense the precise timing for rituals. The Crowleys provided their healing knowledge, ensuring participants survived increasingly dangerous ceremonies. The Whitmores offered their connection to the forest, which provided materials and concealment. The Hulcoms brought their understanding of underground spaces, having excavated chambers that connected their territories through a network of tunnels. The Blackwoods supplied their mastery of blood magic, the binding agent that made all other supernatural workings possible. The entities each family served revealed themselves to be aspects of something vastly more ancient and powerful. The shadows that whispered to the Ashfords, the presence that granted healing to the Crowleys, the force that blessed Whitmore lands, the voice that spoke from Hulcom mines, and the power that demanded Blackwood blood sacrifices were fragments of what they learned to call the progenitor, a being that existed between dimensions and had been slowly manifesting through their combined efforts for decades. During the Third Confluence in 1894, the families attempted their first coordinated ritual. They had constructed a massive stone circle spanning nearly an acre, with each family responsible for specific sections aligned to their particular supernatural strengths. The ceremony required representatives from each bloodline to contribute not just blood, but memories, dreams, and what they described as pieces of their souls. The ritual lasted 3 days and nights, with participants entering trance states so profound that several required weeks to fully return to normal consciousness. The results were immediate and terrifying. Animals fled the region in unprecedented numbers, creating a dead zone of silence that extended for miles around the ritual site. The weather patterns shifted dramatically, with fog banks appearing and disappearing according to no natural meteorological logic. Most disturbing, people throughout the broader Appalachian region began experiencing shared dreams featuring the same recurring imagery. Vast underground chambers filled with moving shadows, ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with their own light, and the sensation of being watched by something immeasurably old and patient. The families discovered they could now communicate across vast distances through a form of supernatural telepathy. Ashford seers could witness events occurring in Crowley territories hundreds of miles away. Whitmore forests began producing timber with properties that defied natural explanation, wood that was simultaneously harder than steel and flexible enough to bend without breaking. Holcomb mines yielded not just coal, but rare minerals that seemed to generate their own energy. Blackwood blood rituals began affecting people who had never participated in their ceremonies, influencing the thoughts and actions of entire communities. By 1900, the families had established permanent infrastructure to support their expanding operations. They created the Bloodline Registry, a detailed genealogical record that tracked not just their own descendants, but individuals throughout Appalachia who showed signs of supernatural sensitivity. They built the Sanctuary Network, a series of underground chambers connected by tunnels that allowed rapid movement between territories without detection. They established the Harvest Protocol, a systematic approach to identifying and recruiting individuals whose unique psychological profiles made them suitable for various ritual purposes. The families also began infiltrating legitimate institutions. Ashford descendants became prominent in banking and finance, using their enhanced intuition to accumulate vast wealth through investments that seemed impossibly prescient. Crowley family members established medical practices and hospitals, positions that gave them access to large numbers of people during vulnerable moments. Whitmore's expanded into logging companies and eventually paper mills, controlling information flow through their influence over local newspapers. Holcomb's transitioned from simple mining operations to major industrial corporations, their supernatural knowledge of underground resources making them indispensable to America's growing industrial economy. Blackwoods became involved in politics and law enforcement, their ability to influence minds making them remarkably effective at avoiding prosecution for their increasingly bold activities. The most ambitious phase of their plan began in 1915 with the establishment of what they called the convergence sites. These were locations throughout Appalachia where the families constructed elaborate ritual complexes disguised as legitimate facilities. A Crowley-operated sanitarium in Virginia contained hidden chambers where patients underwent procedures designed to enhance their psychic sensitivity. A Whitmore lumber mill in Kentucky included a basement level where workers participated in monthly ceremonies that bound them to the family's supernatural network. A Holcomb coal processing plant in West Virginia featured a foundry where metals were combined with supernatural substances to create objects that served as focal points for the entity's influence. The families realized they needed to expand beyond their traditional territories to prepare for what they understood would be the progenitor's eventual physical manifestation. They began what they called the dispersal initiative, deliberately spreading family members throughout American society while maintaining their supernatural connections. Ashford descendants became prominent in early Hollywood, their supernatural charisma making them natural performers, and their ability to manipulate emotions, allowing them to influence American culture through entertainment. Crowley family members established practices in major cities, creating networks of supernatural healing that attracted wealthy and influential clients. Whitmore's expanded into the emerging automobile industry, their supernatural connection to materials making them invaluable in developing new manufacturing processes. Holcombs became involved in the early oil industry, their underground sensing abilities helping them locate petroleum deposits that others missed. Blackwoods moved into organized crime, their supernatural influence making them untouchable by law enforcement. The most disturbing development was the emergence of what the families called the hybrid generation. Children born to parents from different supernatural bloodlines began manifesting abilities that combined and amplified their inherited powers. These individuals could perform feats that surpassed anything achieved by previous generations, healing fatal injuries with a touch, manipulating the emotions of entire crowds, sensing the location of valuable resources from hundreds of miles away, and most unnervingly, communicating directly with the entities without requiring elaborate rituals. By 1920, the families had established monitoring stations throughout the United States, locations where hybrid generation descendants could track supernatural activity and coordinate responses to potential threats. They created the suppression protocol, a systematic approach to eliminating individuals who discovered too much about their operations or showed signs of developing supernatural abilities outside their control. They established the recruitment network, identifying and cultivating individuals whose psychological profiles made them suitable for various roles in their expanding organization. The families also began preparing for what they understood would be the final phase of their centuries-long project. They created the manifestation sites, locations where the accumulated supernatural energy from decades of rituals was being concentrated and focused. These sites, disguised as everything from industrial facilities to religious retreats, were designed to serve as anchor points for the progenitor's transition from its current interdimensional existence to full physical presence in our reality. The most ambitious manifestation site was established in 1925 in a remote valley that bordered territories controlled by all 5 families. This location, known only as the Nexus, featured an underground complex that extended for miles in all directions, with chambers designed to accommodate thousands of participants in simultaneous rituals. The construction required workers from all 5 bloodlines, individuals whose supernatural abilities allowed them to excavate and build in ways that conventional engineering couldn't achieve. The Nexus contained facilities that defied rational explanation. The central chamber featured a circular pool filled with a substance that appeared to be liquid shadow, constantly moving and occasionally forming shapes that resembled reaching hands or grasping tentacles. The resonance halls were designed to amplify supernatural energies, with walls that seemed to pulse in rhythm with participants' heartbeats. The preparation chambers were equipped with restraints and instruments whose purposes were documented in journals written in codes that changed each time they were read. As the 1920s progressed, the family's influence had grown to encompass significant portions of American society. They controlled major industries, influenced political decisions, and shaped cultural trends through their supernatural abilities and accumulated wealth. They had established recruitment networks that identified and cultivated individuals with useful talents, creating a shadow organization that operated parallel to legitimate institutions. The entities they served had grown stronger and more active, their influence extending far beyond the original Appalachian territories. Reports began surfacing of supernatural phenomena in major cities, unexplained disappearances in industrial facilities, and mass psychological episodes that affected entire communities. The families understood these were signs that their decades of preparation were approaching culmination. The progenitor's influence had become so pervasive that it began affecting reality itself in subtle but measurable ways. Photographs taken in areas with high supernatural activity showed anomalous shadows and light patterns. Recording equipment malfunctioned in predictable patterns around family members. Most disturbing, people throughout the regions under family influence began experiencing collective alterations in memory, forgetting events that had occurred and remembering things that never happened. By 1930, the families had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had successfully coordinated supernatural forces on a continental scale, creating a network of influence that touched virtually every aspect of American society while remaining completely hidden from public awareness. The ancient entities they served had grown strong enough to begin manifesting physical effects in the material world, and the infrastructure necessary for their complete emergence was nearly complete. The stage was set for the final phase of a plan that had been generations in the making, a convergence of supernatural forces that would fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself. The families had sacrificed their humanity, their individual identities, and the lives of countless others to serve entities whose true purposes remained hidden even from their most devoted servants. What they had unleashed could no longer be contained or controlled, and the consequences of their centuries-long bargain were about to reshape the world in ways that would make their previous supernatural achievements seem insignificant by comparison.